Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Lunch with a Scientist. Again, I'm Leah from Headwaters Science Institute, and today we have Rebekah Dickens Ohara joining us. Hi, Rebekah.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
So Rebekah is joining us all the way from Hawaii. She is the CEO of the Akaka Foundation for Tropical Forests, and today she's going to tell us a little bit about some of her research. Rebekah is a PhD candidate at Purdue University in their Forestry and Natural Resources program. And her work has been focused on conservation and a movement that encourages and empowers local citizenry through education and the creation of sustainable livelihood options in Hawaii. And so today, she's going to talk to us about her research into how community managed forests might come about in Hawaii. And we are really excited to hear her talk. So Rebekah, I will let you take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Leah. Let me just get this set up here. So I'm in the middle of a puppy and a cat fight, so hopefully it's not too disruptive. So thanks so much for being here, and thanks so much to the Headwaters Science Institute for having me. So as Leah mentioned, I work for a nonprofit called Akaka Foundation for Tropical Forests, and then I'm also a PhD candidate in the Forestry and Natural Resources Department at Purdue. So I'm a social scientist, and my work focuses on community managed forests. It's applied work, which means that the intention of my research is that it will help support conservation and policies on the ground. Today, I'm going to talk about my research into community forests, and I'll start by talking about what led to my current studies, and I'll provide an introduction into social science and community forests, and then describe my research. So I wanted to start by sharing a bit about the journey that led me to my current research. For my undergraduate degree, I studied anthropology, focusing on primate studies. This was really interesting to me and provided me with an ability to not only work in Costa Rica, but to study spider monkeys, capuchin, and howler monkeys. Studying anthropology also gave me a better understanding of habitat loss and deforestation, and that's what led me to seek a career in forest conservation. One important lesson that I learned during my undergrad was that many forest conservation efforts have had negative impacts on people who live close to or rely on forests. A lot of indigenous people have been negatively impacted by efforts to protect forests because sometimes the establishment of conservation areas have led to people being kicked out or excluded from their ancestral homelands. So this is true in places around the world, but fortunately there are approaches to conservation of forests that include communities in decision-making and management and really focus on community needs as well as forest needs. So that's what I'm interested in. So after my undergrad, I wanted to better understand how forest conservation can also support local community well-being. I completed a program called Environment and Community at Humboldt State University, and I did my research in Ecuador, trying to better understand how forest conservation can be achieved in ways that also support people who live near or in forests. This, along with my current research, are examples of social science of natural resources. So natural resource social science asks, how do people manage, take care of, or use natural resources? And natural resources are the things that people can use that come from the natural environment. So air, water, minerals, forests, agricultural land, that's all examples of natural resources. My current research looks at, I skipped ahead. My current research looks at how community forests might emerge in Hawaii. And the purpose is to find win-win solutions that can help protect Hawaii's forests and address the needs of local people. So my research explores how we can both protect forests and ensure that people in Hawaii have access to forests and forest resources. can we protect forests in a way that also provides sustainable jobs for local people? The reason I study this is because I believe that people are part of nature, and we can take care of forests in a way that supports forest health and also cultural and livelihood needs. And there's a lot of examples from around the world that show us that this can be done successfully. So while it's just skipping ahead, I don't know why. While community-based forests management varies greatly in practice, they're characterized by including forest communities in decision-making and management. So community managed forests the local communities always have some level of decision-making. And then secondly, there are social and economic benefits incorporated in the management for the local communities. And that's one of the main objectives of the community forest. Finally, ecological sustainability is an important part of community forests. So making sure that the forest is managed in a way that's sustainable and ensures ecological health of the forests. So community forests really provide a way for local and indigenous communities to bargain for more power, access, and decision-making. Colonialism has left a really profound impact on indigenous communities around the world and has disrupted customary land ownership and indigenous practices. Community forest management is important in Hawaii because when the Hawaiian monarchy was overthrown, Native Hawaiians lost access to a lot of their land, which impacted their ability to care for the land and provide for themselves as they had for many, many years prior to being colonized. So from my perspective, community forest offers a way to sort of bargain with the state for more power and improve community outcomes as well as forest outcomes, forest ecological health outcomes. So today, a majority of the Hawaiian Islands are owned by the state or are privately owned. There are about 4.1 million acres covering the major Hawaiian Islands, and over 1.5 million acres of that is state-owned. And then you can see the other large landowners here as well. So despite this, Hawaii is home to the largest number of endangered or threatened species in the United States. So while the state of Hawaii does its best to manage its lands, they really don't have enough resources or staff to fully protect Hawaii's forests. So community forests could really provide a way for states to improve forest protection and to also support local communities' access to forests. So the purpose of my research is to articulate how community forests might emerge in Hawaii. And essentially what I'm doing is asking, what are the pathways for developing community management of forests in Hawaii? So looking at the major landowners such as the state, are there legal ways that already exist for community managed forests to emerge? Or are there pathways that need to be paved in order for that to happen? Secondly, how can lessons learned from other community managed marine ecosystems in Hawaii be applied to developing community managed forests here? So while we don't really have examples of community managed forests on state lands, for example, in Hawaii, we do have examples of community managed marine ecosystems. So part of what I'm doing is looking at those examples and sort of what we've learned from those examples and how might that apply to community forests here. Finally, how can the lessons learned from other community managed forests across the world be applied to the development of community forests here in Hawaii? So looking at examples from all over the world and really focusing on examples that share a colonial and indigenous history, because that's an important sort of context within which community forests might emerge. So for my first chapter, I'm going to synthesize best practices and indicators of success found in community-based marine programs in Hawaii. So what that means is best practices are basically how people have figured out how to do things in a way that leads to success. So after synthesizing best practices, I'll integrate semi-structured interviews and discuss the current scope of community-based stewardship in Hawaii and the pathways and opportunities for community-based management on different land tenures, which is just land ownership systems, as well as looking at indicators of success and challenges to implementation. So my methods are a literature review, and that's going to be done of examples of marine systems in Hawaii that are collaboratively managed. And then semi-structured interviews will be used to better understand the status of community forests in Hawaii and opportunities and barriers for their development. So I'll be doing interviews, or I have conducted interviews with leaders in the state, leaders at Kamehameha Schools, who is also a large landowner, and Department of Hawaiian Homeland. So really looking at how do leaders within these organizations look at and think about community forests? What do they perceive as the pathways to community forests on their lands? And then also, what do they perceive as the challenges? And then also talking to people who are involved in community-based stewardship on Hawaii and talking to them about challenges and what they believe will help them achieve success. So there's not a lot of examples of community managed forests in Hawaii, but there are examples of community managed marine areas. So here are two examples of community managed marine areas. The Ha'ena community-based subsistence fishing area on the island of Kauai, and the Ka'upulehu tri-weight fisheries and reef restoration on the island of Hawaii. There's also the terrestrial or land-based work of the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana on the island of Kaho'olawe. So I'm looking at literature that's already been written, a lot of it done by local authors, and synthesizing that literature to understand sort of what the processes have been for establishing these community-based areas, and then looking at both the challenges and the opportunities therein. So my chapter will integrate the lessons learned from community-based management here in the Hawaiian Islands. And I started this by finding all the research I could through a literature review on community management of natural resources here in Hawaii. So to do a literature review, you basically start by identifying all of the search terms that you think will result in helping you to find the most relevant literature. So what I've done here, and I searched the Web of Science, which is a database for professional publications and scientific literature. And then I also use Google Scholar. So basically I put these terms as well as these terms. So if an article has the term community managed forest, and it also has the term Hawaiian, it would come up. So then all of those results that come up, I review them to see if they meet my inclusion criteria and are relevant for this research. And then, so that's the first step, finding the relevant literature. And then the second step is to review the relevant literature and code for themes. So really reading each article and coding, so highlighting for themes. So if I find challenges that happened in a community-based marine management system, then that's going to be coded as challenges, and then all of the different articles are coded in that same way, and then that helps me to synthesize these results. For my second chapter, I'm conducting a systematic literature review focused on case studies of community forests that both share an Indigenous context and colonial history, and also focus on subsistence or livelihoods. So that's a lot of words, but I'll go into that in a minute. But the purpose of this is to provide us another synthesis that shows approaches to integrating subsistence or livelihood as a principal feature of community forests to support future efforts in Hawaii. And so basically, this is my search term matrix for the systematic literature review. And so if community managed forests and forest and Indigenous and state owned all show up in an article, then that will, those results will come up. So basically it can be any of these words and any of these words and any of these words and any of these words. So the inclusion criteria for chapter 2, all of the articles that come back have to include case studies of community managed forests. They need to have an Indigenous context and colonial history. And examples need to incorporate subsistence or livelihood as a key feature of the program. And subsistence is just the way that people survive, and livelihood is like jobs or economy. So the goal here is to better understand how other groups have approached community forests and the role of livelihoods in community forests. I'm trying to understand what approaches are common, what approaches have worked well, what are the key indicators of success, what lessons have been learned, and how might that apply to Hawaii given what we learned in chapter 1. So some themes that have emerged in my literature review for chapter 1 thus far, and that was the review of community-based programs in Hawaii, some of which are called community-based subsistence fishing areas, and that's the acronym here. So some of the literature has really emphasized the important role of nonprofits in community-based subsistence fishing areas in Hawaii. So I think we can apply that to community-based forest planning as well, and consider that nonprofits may have a very important role in helping facilitate community forests here. CBSFAs were also very difficult and time-consuming to set up. So that's another important consideration, and really looking at how we can simplify these processes for communities who want to take this next step towards community management. Another lesson learned was that the language in laws that were created for the CBSFAs were not always reflected, they did not always reflect community language. So in community-based management, the community comes together and helps define rules for management. So maybe a rule is that you don't fish in certain areas, or you don't harvest certain trees. But what the literature found here was that the language that the communities came up with was quite a bit different than what actually ended up in the law. So reflecting on that, it's important that we look at how we might have the language of the community be more consistent in the laws in action. Finally, we see high costs for communities in time, planning, and organization. So it's important for governments or nonprofits or agencies who are working to support community forest management to really find ways to minimize those costs for communities. So far I've completed 7 interviews with DLNR and DOFA leadership, and that is, DLNR is the Department of Land and Natural Resources. DOFA is Division of Forestry and Wildlife, and those are both state leadership for state managed lands. And then I've conducted 3 interviews with community-based forest projects, people involved with those, and then 1 with the USDA Forest Service. There are a few emerging themes that I think are important. One is that there's a lot of interest at the state level. DLNR and DOFA representatives I spoke with are very supportive of community-based forest efforts, although they acknowledge that there is a lack of clear pathways forward for developing community-based forests on state-managed lands. So I'm really hoping that my research helps to move that forward and helps us to understand what the pathways are legally for establishing community forests on state-owned land. Another finding is that most of the people I talk to about community-based stewardship are very interested in subsistence and agroforestry. And agroforestry is like a mixture of regular forests, what you think of as forests, like trees, and then also crops that you can eat or use for medicine. So that's why I sort of adapted my literature review to focus on examples around the world do incorporate subsistence and agroforestry, because I want to learn how these other places across the world have approached this and how they've found success in incorporating forest conservation and agroforestry or subsistence. And then another finding is that it's really important for whatever forests are identified for community forests to be accessible to the community. So if a community forest is going to be effective, it needs to be nearby where people can access it. It can't be, 5-hour drive away from a community. It needs to be nearby and accessible. So a couple of other findings that I've found in terms of challenges, the state moves really slowly. That's one common theme that emerged in the literature. And it's also important to, it's also challenging to keep a working group of community members up to speed and engaged. There's also a lack of financial and personnel resources, which can be a really big challenge. So if everyone in a community has jobs and families and other things going on, it can be hard for community members to really commit the time needed to establish community managed forests. So looking at ways to navigate that and allocate and find resources to support these efforts to create community managed forests is very important in order to lead to successful outcomes. And then I just wanted to overview real quickly some of the literature that's shown indicators of success in community forestry. So there's been a ton of literature around the world that talks about what makes a successful community managed forest. And I'd like to talk about a few of these. So having a clearly defined community or management area is really important. So making sure you know where who the community is, what the management area is, and that those people have secure tenure. So that means that they have some sort of security in knowing that the work that they're putting in to build a community forest is going to reap some benefit for them. And then strong institutions with technical and financial capacity. So really having the infrastructure that's equipped with the financial needs and sort of personnel needs to support community forests is extremely important. forest users need to have a role in rulemaking and enforcement. And then forest users also need to agree upon management targets and objective. They need to have a sound management plan and a sound monitoring plan. And really, for community forests to work, the government, who often owns the land or manages the land, needs to support the local efforts and respect local authority as defined by the agreements. So there's a few things that come up when considering the design of community forests in Hawaii in light of the commonly accepted indicators of success. It's clear that land tenure will play a really important feature in the opportunities for where community forests can develop. And there's the reality of land tenure in Hawaii and the lack of processes for sort of handing over control to local communities means that we need to really create some processes that will support that. But there are ideas for that, such as creating community-based leases on state lands, which is essentially where the community would kind of rent state lands for long term. So they'd have a little bit more flexibility in how they access and use resources. Another example, which I didn't get into in this talk, but it's basically that the more decision-making and management that local community groups have in community forests typically means that there will be more successful results. So really having strong local community decision-making is very important. And then also examples from Nepal, Mexico, and India all highlight the importance and value of indigenous knowledge and local decision-making. So I have a lot more work to do, but this is where I am so far in my research. And thank you all so much for taking the time to listen to this talk.
Thank you, Rebekah. That was great. So I have a question to kind of kick us off here, sort of based on your last slide. You talked about using Nepal, Mexico, and India for some examples of what to do right. And I wondered if you could give an example of a community managed forest from one of those places and talk a little bit about what activities are actually going on there and how the management looks.
Yeah, so Mexico provides a really good example of a country that has committed to community forestry. And there's examples within Mexico that are seen as successful, and there's examples that, don't always hit the mark. So community forests have 3 goals usually: social, economic, ecological. So you really want to hit all 3 of those goals, but it can be really hard to have positive outcomes on all 3. But in Mexico, one of the things Mexico really has going for its community forestry is that they have a lot of infrastructure for actual forestry. So what I mean by that is they do timber production on community managed forests. So communities are able to really have secure livelihoods and sustainably managed forests in a way that really builds up the community and sort of addresses poverty. So I think Mexico is a very good example of that. And part of that is the way that land tenure or land ownership functions in Mexico. So it's very different than land tenure is here in Hawaii. So it's a little bit harder to sort of apply those lessons here. But they're definitely a good example of how having a strong economic component supports community forestry, and having strong institutions and technical capacity also supports that. So they have, mills within the community forestry areas, and they have, technical expertise from the local universities and local agencies. So that combination really kind of supports that movement.
So it sounds like a sustainably managed community forest also has some functional economic component as well. Is that correct?
Yes. So that's a really important part. And I actually think I might have skipped my overview of community forests and what it means. But yeah, so that's a very important part of a lot of community forests. Although some community forests are managed for cultural reasons. So some community managed forests may be set up just so people have access to forests and they can, make sure that they're growing culturally important species for plant medicine or cultural practices. So it doesn't always have an economic component. It often does, but there is always a strong social component, whether it's economic or cultural.
That's fascinating. So we have a question here from an audience member, Lara. Going back to when you talked a little bit about how a lot of this land has been taken from Native people. So when you're dealing with some of those indigenous people, maybe some that have had less access to education, and trying to convince them that considering the scientific data is important, how do you navigate their social and religious beliefs?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. I think part of my studies have been in what's called decolonizing methodologies. So looking at how we can kind of approach understanding the world in a way that doesn't assume science is always correct. And I have a lot of respect for the scientific method and scientific traditions, and I use science in my work. But that said, like for example, in Hawaii, there are traditional ways of knowing that are also based on observation over time and experimentation over time. So I guess from my perspective, it's more of, and there's some really good research on this by Maria Tango, and she talks about weaving knowledge systems together. So rather than integrating knowledge systems, like you have indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge and science knowledge, you try to blend them together, but they have very different worldviews, right, that they come from. She talks about weaving them together, so more like a braiding. So you take the whole system and really respect the whole system of knowledge and kind of integrate in that way. So I guess that's I haven't run into that in my work here in Hawaii. Stewardship and malama aina is a really core value of Native Hawaiians. So I haven't run into that as a problem. But I do think that, communicating sort of and finding sort of parallel points where science and traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge can intersect and support each other is really important. But yeah, I guess I think I just haven't really run into that. I have run into, I've thought a lot about for my research, sort of how to best work with Native Hawaiian communities, and that's really important for me as a white person coming from the mainland. I live in Hawaii, but I'm not from here. So for me, it's that's a process of learning and really working with the community from the ground up, and it involves a lot of listening, I guess.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And it sounds like to the Native Hawaiian people, subsistence fishing is very important. So I'd like to go back to what you were talking about with the community-based subsistence fishing areas. What kinds of cultural practices or other things are happening in those areas?
Well, there was a very long process to establish community-based subsistence fishing areas in Hawaii, because the coastal lands are managed by the state as well. And so traditionally, there's a traditional practice in Hawaii of taking care of land from the mountain to the sea. So in geographical units that really range from the top of the watershed down to the sea. And there's traditions of sustainable management that, kept Hawaiians alive prior to colonization here. So there's a rich history of practice, and a lot of that is interwoven into Hawaiian worldviews that helps manage effectively and sustainably the local resources. So, the mo'olelo, or the storied histories of places, oli or chants, all of these oral histories really help to pass on that generational knowledge. And I think having the community-based subsistence fishing areas as a process that can be pursued by communities in Hawaii now offers a way for Hawaiian communities to really engage in those practices and to set their own rules for how fish are harvested, when they're harvested, who harvests, and that type of thing. And that's really important in community management. So whether it's marine resources or forest resources, the community that lives near or within the place really should be a part of designing the rules that need to be followed for sustainability. Usually when people are part of making rules, they're a lot more likely to follow them and understand the logic behind them because they created them as a community. So that's a really sort of central tenet to community-based management and central kind of hypothesis behind this kind of work, is that when communities are more involved and when they have more decision-making and power, rules are more likely to be adhered to than if it's a top-down rule-making process.
That makes sense. Sounds like the community is a huge part of that, and that actually kind of leads me to my last question, which we're going to wrap up soon here. But I wanted to know, what can people do in their own community if they want to see some protected land emerge that can be used as a community managed forest?
I think it all depends on where you are, because different places have different land ownership. But community forests have emerged on privately owned lands. Across the continental US, there are community forests on US Forest Service lands. So looking into that and those opportunities is one way to start. And another is definitely on state lands. That makes a lot of sense here in Hawaii, is community forests on state lands. But I think on the continental US, the US Forest Service has different programs for community forestry. So I would start there, looking at what opportunities they have. And then secondly, I would look at, are there large landowners that, don't have the capacity to sort of manage all of their lands? And, a lot of times there can be win-win situations where, local communities can actually bring better management practices to areas where, maybe there's just a vast tract of land that it's hard to manage with just a small group of people. So having a community working toward that goal can be helpful. And then, sometimes those I've read about in the Pacific Northwest, there's examples of community forestry focused on beekeeping and mushroom harvesting. So different processes or different economic livelihood options can be integrated into community forestry initiatives. And I think that's really where you see communities benefiting as well as the forests.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, if you're watching, those are some ideas to get involved, and I hope that you will take some action. And I want to thank Rebekah Dickens Ohara so much for presenting your awesome research and telling us about community managed forests in Hawaii.
Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
All right, so if you are watching, of course, Lunch with a Scientist was designed so that you could see into the minds of some professional scientists. If you are a scientist and this inspires you, please get in touch. We would love to share your research with our students. And otherwise, I will sign off and say, I hope you have a good day, Rebekah.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Aloha.